the internet in China. It's a high-tech dystopia, and officials from around the world are going to China to learn how to build their own internet dystopias. Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Internet censorship in China today has reached absurd levels. People have been jailed for the things they say on WeChat. Here's a quick list of some of the things censored on the Chinese internet. Tiananmen Square Massacre, an empty chair, Winnie the Pooh, and even the letter N. That must make the Chinese version of Sesame Street so difficult. But to find out exactly how bizarre the internet censorship in China is, I sat down with Sarah Cook. She's a senior research analyst and director of the China Media Bulletin for Freedom House, an NGO focused on research and advocacy for democracy, political freedom, and human rights. Thank you for joining us today, Sarah.
My pleasure.
So how bad is internet censorship in China?
Well, to be honest, the Chinese Communist Party has created the most multifaceted and sophisticated system of internet censorship in the world. And actually in Freedom House's Freedom on the Net report, for like the last 3 years, China has been designated as the worst abuser of internet. Internet freedom.
Worse than Syria?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different factors. So it's worse than Syria and Iran. I think it's a different dynamic in terms of what the political situation in these countries are. I mean, in Syria, it might be that you don't have internet access because something's been bombed out. In China, there's quite a good amount of actual access to the internet, and it's increased. But the extent to which people are able to actually do certain things on the internet and the scale of controls that are exercised, that are in place, even if they're not always activated and exercised, is tremendous. It goes through the entire internet system in China, and it's by far the most sophisticated and pervasive of anywhere else in the world.
So I know a lot of people sort of make the mistake of thinking of internet censorship as like the government preventing certain information from getting out there. But a big part of it is actually pushing a message the government wants. What is the message the Communist Party is pushing?
Well, it depends, really. It depends on the topic, and it depends on the audience in some ways. You have the kind of set taboo topics. So, not letting people know about June 4th or about Falun Gong or about Taiwanese
the Tiananmen
Square Massacre. Tiananmen Square Massacre. Or about what's really happening to Uyghurs and Tibetans in different parts of China. But part of that is also manipulating the message. So, again, it's this combination of censorship and propaganda that are really two sides of the same coin. And so some of it is suppressing the bad news, and then the part of it is promoting the good news. And actually, like Xi Jinping talks about promoting like positive.
The China story.
The positive story. Well, the China story, that's more outside of China. Telling a good China story, that's more outside of China.
Okay.
Within China, they wanted to promote like positivity. Okay. And just to give an example, like just the extremes to which they go to do that, like you see from leaked censorship directives that they will tell websites that, let's say the landing page of like a Google News type of website, the top story has to be this. And in some cases, I think there's a sense that the rankings on social media platforms of like what's the hottest news now is manipulated. Last year, when the constitutional was changed to basically enable Xi Jinping to become president for life, if you looked at like the top ranking topics on social media, it was like how to eat noodles on a high-speed train.
This is inside China.
This is inside China. These are on platforms that are run by Chinese companies, and so
not necessarily like Google. This is like Chinese.
No, these searches. This is Chinese social media. This is Weibo and Sina Weibo and WeChat. So it's. Yeah, these are Chinese, because the Chinese government uses the Great Firewall to block the kinds of social media applications that we all use, Facebook, Twitter. Those aren't really accessible to people in China unless they have a way of jumping the firewall. But within China, then you have these kind of Chinese alternatives that become extremely popular, and they have whole departments of staff whose job is basically to identify and censor content, and then in some cases, based on instructions, specifically to promote other content.
Wow. So when Xi Jinping became president for life, the main story was how to eat noodles.
That was like one of the top ranking stories on Weibo because they had censored because it's a combination, right? It's because they had censored so much of the keywords in the conversations that Chinese people were trying to have about this like important news topic. and so you didn't have that trending. And then I think we suppose that there was some kind of manipulation of the trending as well.
So in the West, sort of the original model, the internet was that it was free and open. China is offering an alternative model to the internet. What is the China internet model?
Well, the Chinese government would say it's a form of cyber sovereignty. It's the idea that the internet does not cross borders. It's that the internet really stops at the border and you create a certain a virtual border. And in China, it's the case of the Great Firewall. But it's also elements of various laws like the cybersecurity law and requiring data centers to have the, to be applications or things like iCloud to have its servers inside China and not be able to be outside of China. So that whatever happens within China is really under the Communist Party's control. And there's multiple ways in which that's done, either technologically or also legally and administratively. But that's in a lot of ways the model. And it's a combination of this kind of high-tech techno-dystopia that is maybe less achievable for other countries, depending on their technological caliber and resources, monetary resources. But it is also a different model that is maybe easier to mimic in sort of specific kinds of legislation, arresting bloggers, sentencing them to prison, arresting. Forcing local social media companies to do their own censorship, and then injecting this type of kind of proactive manipulation of paid government commentators or other forms of what the Communist Party calls kind of gaining the upper hand in terms of, quote, guiding public opinion. So it's all of those factors combined, but ultimately it's this idea that within China's borders, particularly within a particular country's borders, you should have full control over what people can see and do on the internet and not allow these companies outside like Facebook or Twitter or others to be able to, or the New York Times, to produce information that your people can read and see. So if you look at China's model of internet controls, it's not just censorship, which we think of a lot. It's a combination of censorship, but also extensive and pervasive surveillance and monitoring of what people are doing online, real name registration, so that's how they can arrest people, because they can trace that this person who has a seemingly anonymous account actually belongs to this particular individual. You can't be anonymous on the Chinese internet. And increasingly with people who are on Twitter, they're not anonymous on Twitter. Somehow the Chinese government is figuring out ways to trace it back, the Twitter account back to their phone number, and they're getting a knock at the door for what they're writing on Twitter.
Even though Twitter is banned in China.
Even though Twitter is banned in China, people are jumping the firewall. It's open, and and in some cases, people who have like 3,000 followers. I mean, not people with millions of followers necessarily, but they're getting knocks at the door in some cases just for opening an account or things like that, and they're being so that's they're being harassed, and so that's and even arrested.
I just need to make sure that's not happening to the good people of the People's Daily Twitter account. Right?
No, of course not. Right. So that's the thing. So there was actually, I think, a relatively recent case of some employee at Chinese state media getting in trouble for creating a personal Twitter account. When you have Chinese state media like Xinhua and People's Daily and China Daily and CGTN, they all have with millions of followers, and they're able to access talk to millions of people around the world. But if you're a Chinese human rights lawyer, a professor,
or even an individual employee of those state-run companies,
yes, then people are starting to get in trouble, and that's something very new. A year ago, that wasn't happening. That's something relatively recent. So you've got a combination of censorship, of surveillance, and of intimidation and harassment, and this kind of proactive manipulation. That all of it together creates a very interesting environment in China, because on the one hand you have a lot of information that's censored and that's inaccessible, but there's still a vibrancy about it, and all kinds of things that, if you think about what you do with your phone, yes, you check the New York Times, you check news that would probably be censored in China. You also look up what movie is playing nearby. You use Google Maps to go and try to navigate how to get to your friend's house. You look up what the ranking is on this particular restaurant. All of those types of things are accessible in China, although they're with Chinese apps and not the ones that we would usually use. So it's kind of this illusion of choice that's created, where the Chinese government can control everything. It doesn't necessarily, and this space is shrinking, but it's created a system where it could control everything if it wants, and it's able to nitpick and pull out and censor the things it doesn't want people talking about.
After this short break, Sarah will be back to tell us about what happens when someone gets on the wrong side of Chinese censors. So what happens to people inside of China who get on the wrong side of the internet censors?
Well, it depends. It can range from having a particular post be deleted to having your entire account be canceled. So there's lots of examples on these kind of parallel social media applications in China run by Chinese companies, people with millions of followers. Just like that, it's gone. Mm-hmm. Press a button, it's gone, all gone. And in some cases that has real impact on their livelihood too, because people will earn money because they're a famous author or whatever, and celebrities. So it can range from from those types of examples of losing, having a post deleted, having your account canceled, all the way through to being sentenced to prison. In some cases, to very long prison terms, 10 years, 15 years, very, very long prison terms.
So if I were making China Uncensored inside of China, what would happen to me?
A few things would happen. First of all, you would really have no way of distributing it. So you would try to open, if you tried to open an account on one of the Chinese social media, either they wouldn't let you, or very quickly after they saw what you were sharing, they would just delete it, and that would be the end of that. You would try to open a website and you wouldn't be able to. And then you would be under liability, potentially personally, especially if you create an episode where you were, say, mocking Xi Jinping.
Which I would never do.
Which you would never do, because China Uncensored doesn't do any mockery of Chinese officials or the Communist Party. So then you would potentially be liable to being arrested, getting a knock on your door in the middle of the night, and be taken away, and then be jailed, and have a trial that lasts for half an hour, and not being able to access a lawyer, and then however long and they'll have all the so-called evidence. But we've actually seen that. We've seen people who just posted things, making just humorous. There's a lot of people in China who've gotten in trouble for posting humorous things.
A lot, the memes about Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh.
Yes. So for example, I don't know anybody who's actually been jailed for sharing or posting a meme related to Xi Jinping and Winnie the Pooh, but certainly heavily censored. Mm-hmm. And there have been other people who have, posted something that was a different kind of a mockery of Xi, who have been sent to administrative detention, or I think in one case even sentenced to like 2 years in prison.
Now, this internet model that China is creating, they are trying to export that around the world, right? I mean, that's got to be appealing to other authoritarian regimes.
Yes, and I would say not always even just authoritarians per se, but I think what we've seen over time is that there were already elements, even without deliberate projection and export from China, that were being adopted by other regimes like Iran or Vietnam. And then I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is that the Communist Party has actually been much more explicit about wanting to promote their model. And make their model not only for other countries, but even trying to set international standards. And that gets into more technological stuff, but that relates, say, for example, to 5G standards and others, so that their standards become adopted elsewhere and they even use words like the consensus internationally.
That's creepy.
But yes, but yes, so you definitely, but now I think more actively you have efforts to promote the China model. In some cases, it's in terms of the export of technologies. In a lot of cases, it's different. It's more about other kinds of know-how. So one of the things we found with the latest issue of Freedom on the Net was that we looked at how many countries had sent officials to China to have some kind of training related to new media or so-called information management. And actually found that out of the 65 countries, 36 had sent officials. And that included places like Thailand or Vietnam, say, who have very heavy internet restrictions, but also places like the Philippines, for example, that doesn't, or parts of, I think, even Latin American countries that have a fairly open internet, and they were sending officials there for some kind of a training.
Any European countries, or?
I don't remember the specific list of countries. I would be surprised, because one of the reasons that people also go on this is also because it's kind of a nice all expenses paid junket to China. And so that can be attractive for some random Filipino official in the Ministry of Communication.
Yeah. So this technology didn't come out of thin air. How did Western tech companies help build this system?
So in some cases it was pretty direct. Like, we have reason to believe that Cisco, for example, had played a role in helping the Chinese government build the Great Firewall and other aspects of what's called Golden Shield, which is a system of internet censorship and surveillance. But at the same time, you also have, I would say, indirect examples where from even seemingly innocuous academic exchanges and things like that, or other types of joint venture partnerships, there was a certain degree of know-how that was transferred to Chinese companies or Chinese tech geniuses, and those people were then, applied it to systems that are actually used to suppress internet freedom in China. So that you see a little bit with certain things now coming out about artificial intelligence and the like. And so I think you see that in terms of actually developing the system.
Yeah.
So besides the kind of structural elements on a more micro level, you have Western companies who do engage in censorship for Chinese users. So for example, Apple has deleted apps from Chinese mobile app stores. And that includes specific news websites like NTDTV or news apps or the New York Times. But it also has deleted and removed hundreds of the kinds of applications that let people jump the firewall and access uncensored news. And then you have, for example, LinkedIn that does some level of censorship for people in China in terms of what profiles they're able to see. So you definitely have also ways in which Western companies, when they're dealing with content, have to censor on behalf of the Chinese government.
So it's very disturbing to hear that companies like Microsoft or Google are doing research with Chinese military universities, that technology might be used in Xinjiang for mass surveillance. Do you think there's any possibility that this kind of censorship will be exported to a country like the United States? For instance, I know Mark Zuckerberg has talked about wanting more control over the internet.
Well, I think in some ways we see certain forms of Chinese censorship already coming to the West. And that takes the form in some cases of self-censorship by companies, like airlines who aren't going to put Taiwan in the drop-down menu because they came under Chinese pressure. Or a case, I think it was Mercedes-Benz, where they had a post on a social media website, I think it was Instagram, that was outside China, not accessible to any Chinese people, and it quoted the Dalai Lama, and the Chinese government got upset, and then they actually deleted it, and I think issued this very
official apology.
Yes, official apology. So I think you see that kind of censorship slowly sneaking into the West. But the other thing is that you have a Chinese company called Tencent that runs an instant messaging application called WeChat, and it's used a lot by people in the Chinese diaspora, and including Americans, Canadians, Chinese Americans, Chinese Canadians.
Because it's a way to communicate with people back in China.
People back in China, and they're just used to it. If they come out, they're used to it, and that's how they'll keep in touch with people here. And so you're actually starting to see examples of censorship of people here by WeChat, including in some cases communication between politicians and their constituents, or between local news media in Chinese and Australia, and how much there's almost no reporting that's critical of China in a way that's very different than what's on their main website. So you actually start to see that type, especially for the Chinese diaspora, start to see that sneaking into to the West, and it can have a real political impact in terms of political candidacies. For example, I don't know that China Uncensored, I don't know if you've tried. I'm kind of doubtful that you would be able to create a WeChat account for,
That's a good idea.
And so, you might not, you could test that out. You might not be able to then reach certain constituencies in the United States, even though they're in America, you're in America. And so you see that element starting to infiltrate into the West, and with some level of political ramifications too. And then in terms of surveillance, absolutely. I mean, there was recently a report, I think that it came out that Hikvision, one of these Chinese companies that run surveillance in China, including these facial recognition cameras in Xinjiang, had gotten a contract for the UK Parliament. And it wasn't just for the UK Parliament, I think it was the building with some of their offices. So there was suddenly concern, I think it might have been put on hold now, because they were suddenly concerned about the national security implications of this. So I think it's really more that element of the surveillance and this kind of backdoor concerns, rather than censorship per se, that you see from some of these Chinese technologies. But when you get to questions of Chinese technology being involved in the delivery of content, you see that more in Africa now. That's where you do start to see censorship, because they'll favor Chinese state media channels over, say, the BBC World in terms of the most affordable package. So then you have fewer Africans who are watching BBC World and more who are watching Chinese state media. And you could see that happening in the West, but I don't know if that's going to happen.
Okay. So basically right now it seems like there's a battle going on between sort of the West's free and open internet model and China's sovereignty-based model. What will it take for the free and open model to win?
Well, it's tricky, because one of the problems and I think challenges that we're having is that there are a lot of people, even in democracies, that are questioning the desirability of having as free and open an internet as we have. And that's where you get to questions of regulating Facebook and other social media companies. So I think the first thing is really for democracies to give more attention to and thought to how do you maintain the open internet. How do you protect freedom of expression and privacy within their own borders so that there is a more robust model? And how do you protect against encroachments from the Chinese model, including into our own societies? So, for example, starting out with, really looking at WeChat in the United States or in other democracies and making sure in situations where they're violating the First Amendment rights of people here that there's some kind of repercussion, that they have to, the Chinese government, when they ask foreign companies to censor in China, they like to say, well, the companies like to justify, well, we're working according to local laws. Well, that should really work both ways. The Tencent should be following local laws here, and they should be allowing Chinese Americans and Chinese Canadians and Chinese Australians to have a free, open channels of communication on WeChat. And if not, then they should be fined or should, be sued or something like that, like any company, other company would be. So I think that those are a few of the things in terms of really making sure that we're protecting our systems against Chinese government encroachment and private company encroachment, and creating a more robust system of protecting internet freedom at home. And then I think finding ways to support Chinese people's, desire for a free internet, because there are a lot of Chinese people who would like a free internet. We see that when we publish the China Media Bulletin, we hear from our readers, and when we work with people who are, circumvention tools to reach people in China. There are millions. We estimated there were 20 to 30 million Chinese people who use various tools to jump the firewall in 2018 to access uncensored information. Now, in a country of 1.whatever billion, that's not a lot, but it could probably be a lot more. And there's certainly a constituency that is interested. And the more people learn about how censorship worked and how partial their information environment is, we've found in our surveys and from academic studies, the more likely they are to want to seek out uncensored information. So there's still a lot more to be done in terms of having Chinese people be granted greater access to a free and open internet.
So the Chinese people might be the biggest market for free and open internet.
Yes, and actually I think it's really unfortunate that companies like Facebook or Google are investing in developing ways of trying to get into the Chinese market and have like a censored search engine like Dragonfly, rather than, imagine if all that money was invested in either supporting existing circumvention tools or designing some other type of tools that would allow Chinese people to access the internet freely, because ultimately these companies would benefit. They make their money off of users. Like it doesn't have to be the Chinese government that grants American tech companies access to the holy grail of the Chinese internet market. They could be taking a piece of the pie themselves just by getting more people out of the firewall.
Well, thank you, Sarah. That was incredibly enlightening.
Sure, I'm glad. Thanks for having me.